A cowboy finds a chained wolf with her cub. What happened next? No one could believe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape when Ezra Blackwood first heard the sound that would change his life forever. It was not the familiar whistle of wind through canyon walls, nor the distant lowing of cattle. This was something else entirely, a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry centuries of pain within its trembling notes. Ezra had been tracking stolen cattle for 3 days through the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona Territory. His weathered boots had covered more miles than most men see in a lifetime, and his keen eyes had witnessed things that would haunt lesser souls. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in that forgotten corner of the desert, where ancient rock formations created natural prisons and secrets could remain buried for decades. The 28-year-old cowboy had earned his reputation through grit and unwavering determination. His calloused hands bore the scars of countless encounters with barbed wire, angry bulls, and men who settled disputes with lead rather than words. The Colt .45 that hung low on his right hip had saved his life more times than he cared to remember, and his horse, a sturdy Mustang named Thunder, had carried him through dangers that would have claimed both man and beast if not for their unbreakable bond. As Thunder picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain, Ezra noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the sandy soil, not from cattle, but from something far more sinister. The boot prints were deep and deliberate, suggesting men carrying heavy burdens. More disturbing still were the drag marks that accompanied them, as if something had been pulled against its will across the unforgiving ground. The howling grew stronger as they approached a natural amphitheater formed by towering red rocks. The sound echoed off the stone walls, creating an otherworldly chorus that sent shivers down Thunder's flanks. The horse snorted nervously, his ears flattening against his head as some primal instinct warned him of danger ahead. Ezra dismounted and drew his rifle, the cold metal reassuring in his grip. He had learned long ago that in this harsh land, preparation meant the difference between returning home to tell stories and becoming one himself. Moving with the silent grace of a man who had spent years hunting both animals and men, he crept toward the source of the haunting sound. What he discovered beyond the rocky outcropping defied everything he thought he knew about human nature. In a natural depression surrounded by sheer walls, a massive wolf lay chained to an iron stake driven deep into the rocky ground. The chain was heavy and cruel, designed not just to restrain but to cause suffering with every movement. The wolf's beautiful silver-gray coat was matted with blood and dirt, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that spoke of awareness far beyond that of any ordinary animal. But it was what lay beside her that truly stopped Ezra's heart. A tiny wolf cub, no more than a few weeks old, pressed close to its mother's warmth. The little creature was weak and clearly hungry, its small whimpers barely audible above its mother's labored breathing. The sight of the helpless pair in such desperate circumstances awakened something fierce and protective in the cowboy's chest. Ezra quickly surveyed the area, his trained eyes taking in every detail that might explain this horrific scene. Scattered around the makeshift prison were empty whiskey bottles, the remnants of a campfire, and most telling of all, several sets of boot prints that told a story of multiple visitors over recent days. Someone had not only captured and chained this magnificent creature, but had been returning regularly, likely for some twisted form of entertainment. The wolf's eyes locked onto his, and Ezra saw something in that golden gaze that shook him to his core. There was no wild fury or mindless aggression. Instead, he witnessed a desperate plea for mercy, a mother's anguish for her suffering child, and beneath it all, a flicker of hope that perhaps this new arrival might be different from the others who had tormented her. As he studied the situation more carefully, Ezra noticed that the wolf bore no signs of rabies or disease. Her distress was entirely due to the cruel circumstances of her captivity. The chain around her neck had rubbed raw wounds into her flesh, and her ribs showed prominently beneath her fur, indicating days without adequate food or water. Yet despite her own suffering, she continued to shelter her cub, her maternal instincts overriding her own desperate need for relief. The sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly shattered the desert silence. Ezra quickly moved to a concealed position behind the rocks, his rifle ready as three riders emerged from the canyon entrance. Their laughter echoed off the stone walls as they dismounted and approached the trapped wolf with casual cruelty that made Ezra's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. The leader of the group was a man Ezra recognized from wanted posters, Jake Morrison, a cattle rustler and general troublemaker who had been terrorizing ranchers throughout the territory. His two companions were cut from the same cloth, their faces bearing the hard lines of men who had chosen violence as their profession. They carried themselves with the swagger of those who believed themselves untouchable in this remote location. "Well, look who's still alive," Morrison called out mockingly as he approached the chained wolf. "Thought you might have given up by now, but I guess you're tougher than most of your kind." The wolf struggled weakly against her chains as the men drew closer, her protective instincts flaring despite her weakened condition. The cub pressed even closer to its mother, sensing the approaching danger with the intuition that nature provides to the vulnerable. Morrison reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a thick rope, grinning as he showed it to his companions. The implications of his intentions were clear, and Ezra felt his finger tighten on the rifle's trigger. He had seen enough violence in his life to recognize when a situation was about to turn deadly, and he knew that intervention would likely mean a fight to the death. From his concealed position, Ezra could see that Morrison and his men were armed but careless, their confidence making them sloppy. They had grown comfortable in their remote torture chamber, never expecting to encounter opposition in such a desolate place. This overconfidence might be their downfall, but it would also make them desperate and dangerous when confronted. The wolf's breathing had become more labored, and Ezra realized that time was running out. Whatever sick game these men had been playing was approaching its final act, and both mother and cub would die unless he acted immediately. The weight of their lives settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he knew that this moment would define not just their fate, but his own character. As Morrison approached the wolf with obvious malicious intent, something extraordinary happened. The chained animal turned her head toward Ezra's hiding place and looked directly at him, as if she somehow sensed his presence and his internal struggle. In that golden gaze, he saw not just a plea for help, but a recognition of kindred spirit, another creature fighting to survive in an unforgiving world. The decision crystallized in that moment of connection. Ezra stepped out from behind the rocks, his rifle trained on Morrison's chest, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced death many times and never backed down. "Step away from the wolf." The three men spun around in shock, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons before freezing as they recognized the deadly seriousness in the cowboy's steady aim. Morrison's face twisted into a snarl of frustrated rage as he realized his private entertainment had been discovered by someone with both the skill and the will to interfere. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," Morrison growled, his hand hovering dangerously near his gun. "Best you ride on and forget what you seen here." Ezra's response was as cold and unyielding as the desert wind. "I'm making it my concern." The tension in the air became thick, enough to cut as the four men faced off in the natural arena. The wolf watched with intelligent eyes, somehow understanding that her fate hung in the balance of what was about to unfold. Her cub whimpered softly, the sound serving as a stark reminder of the innocence at stake in this deadly confrontation. Morrison's companions began to spread out, attempting to flank the lone cowboy who had dared to challenge them. But Ezra had not survived years on the frontier by allowing himself to be outmaneuvered. He shifted position smoothly, keeping all three men in his field of vision while maintaining his aim on their leader. "You boys can ride out now, and nobody has to die today," Ezra offered, though his tone suggested he held little hope for a peaceful resolution. "Or you can try your luck against someone who shoots back." The desert wind whistled through the canyon as the standoff continued. each man calculating his chances and measuring his opponents. In the silence that followed, the wolf's labored breathing seemed unnaturally loud, a constant reminder of why this confrontation had begun and what would be lost if it ended badly. Morrison's laugh was harsh and brittle as he shook his head in apparent disbelief. "You'd risk your life for a mangy wolf? Hell, cowboy, you're even more loco than I thought." But as he spoke, Morrison was already in motion, his hand flashing toward his gun with the practiced speed of a man who had killed before. His companions moved simultaneously, their weapons clearing leather in a deadly choreography that had served them well in previous encounters. Ezra's response was instantaneous and decisive. Years of practice and countless life-or-death situations had honed his reflexes to perfection. The rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in his ears faded, all 3 rustlers lay motionless on the rocky ground. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the wolf's heavy breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ezra lowered his rifle and approached the chained animal cautiously, unsure how she would react to his presence now that the immediate threat had passed. To his amazement, the wolf remained calm as he knelt beside her, as if she understood that he had risked his own life to save hers and her cubs. Her amber eyes followed his every movement, but there was no fear in her gaze, only a weary gratitude that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. Ezra examined the heavy chain that bound her, noting that it was secured with a padlock that would require tools to remove. The metal had been deliberately chosen for its weight and strength, designed to ensure that once trapped, no amount of struggling could provide escape. The cruelty of the arrangement spoke to a level of malice that even in his harsh world seemed particularly vicious. While studying the restraints, Ezra became aware of something remarkable. Despite her obvious weakness and the trauma she had endured, the wolf showed no signs of aggression toward him. Instead, she seemed to be watching him with an almost hopeful expectation, as if she somehow understood his intentions and trusted him to follow through. The cub, emboldened by its mother's calm demeanor, ventured a few tentative steps toward the stranger who had appeared so dramatically in their lives. Its small paws made barely any sound on the rocky ground, but its brave curiosity brought a slight smile to Ezra's weathered face. Even in the midst of such suffering, the young creature retained the natural boldness of its kind. Working quickly but carefully, Ezra searched Morrison's body until he found a set of keys. The second key proved to be the correct one, and the heavy lock clicked open with a metallic sound that seemed to echo with promises of freedom. As the chain fell away, the wolf remained perfectly still, as if she could not quite believe that her ordeal was finally ending. Ezra stood back, giving the newly freed animal space to move and adjust to her changed circumstances. To his continued amazement, rather than fleeing immediately to safety, the wolf struggled to her feet and approached him slowly. Her movements were stiff and painful, but her intent was unmistakable. She was offering her thanks in the only way she knew how. When she was close enough to touch, the magnificent creature gently pressed her muzzle against Ezra's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, cowboy and wolf shared an understanding that transcended species. She had acknowledged his kindness, and he had accepted her gratitude with the solemnity it deserved. The cub, seeing its mother's interaction with the strange human, gained courage and approached as well. Its tiny tail wagged tentatively as it sniffed at Ezra's boots, apparently deciding that anyone trusted by its mother must be worthy of its own acceptance. As the immediate drama of the rescue faded, practical concerns began to assert themselves. The wolf and her cub were clearly in need of food and water, and their weakened condition meant they would require time to recover before they could fend for themselves in the wild. Additionally, the 3 dead rustlers presented their own complications. Their bodies would need to be dealt with, and their presence in the area suggested there might be others involved in whatever criminal enterprise had brought them here. Ezra retrieved his water canteen and poured some into his hat, offering it to the thirsty animals. Both wolf and cub drank gratefully, and he could see immediate improvement in their demeanor as the life-giving liquid began to restore their strength. He also had some jerky in his saddlebags, which he offered cautiously, unsure whether the wolf would accept food from his hand. Her hunger overrode any remaining caution, and she accepted the offered meat with gentle care, making sure to share portions with her cub. Watching her maternal devotion even in the midst of her own desperate need, Ezra felt a deep respect for the strength and character of this remarkable animal. As the day wore on and the desert heat began to build, Ezra realized that simply freeing the pair was not enough. In their weakened state, they would become easy prey for the many predators that roam these lands, both animal and human. The decision he faced now would require even more courage than the gunfight that had preceded it. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground nearby, clearly eager to leave this place of violence and return to familiar territory. But as Ezra looked at the wolf and her cub, he knew that his responsibilities here were far from over. Whatever came next would test not only his survival skills but his capacity for compassion in a world that often rewarded neither quality. The sun continued its relentless climb toward its zenith, and important decisions could not be postponed much longer. The desert was unforgiving to the weak and unprepared, and every moment of delay increased the danger to all of them. Yet as he studied the trusting faces of the creatures he had rescued, Ezra knew that he had already committed himself to whatever path lay ahead. As Ezra contemplated his next move, he noticed something peculiar about the wolf's behavior. Rather than showing the typical wariness of a wild animal toward humans, she seemed to be studying him with an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. Her amber eyes tracked his every movement, but not with the calculating gaze of a predator. Instead, she watched him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity and perhaps even recognition. The cub had grown bolder in the past hour, venturing further from its mother's side to explore the immediate area around the natural prison where they had been held captive. Its playful antics seemed incongruous with the grim scene of recent violence, yet they served as a poignant reminder of life's resilience in the face of cruelty. The young wolf pounced on shadows and chased its own tail, displaying the innocent joy that persecution had not yet managed to destroy. Ezra began the grim task of examining Morrison's possessions more thoroughly, hoping to find clues about what had motivated such senseless cruelty. What he discovered in the dead rustler's saddlebags chilled him more than the desert wind that had begun to pick up as afternoon approached. Among the usual items carried by men of Morrison's profession were several items that suggested this wolf capture had been far from random. A leather-bound journal contained detailed observations about wolf behavior, written in Morrison's crude hand but displaying a knowledge that seemed inconsistent with his apparent character. The entries described tracking techniques, behavioral patterns, and most disturbing of all, references to specific wolves being worth considerable sums to certain buyers in distant territories. This had not been sport or simple cruelty, it had been business. Further investigation revealed correspondence with individuals whose names Ezra did not recognize but whose reputations preceded them through the criminal networks that operated throughout the frontier. These were not common outlaws but sophisticated operators who dealt in exotic animals for private collectors and traveling shows. The wolf and her cub had been destined for a fate far worse than death. They were to be sold into permanent captivity for the entertainment of those wealthy enough to afford such rare specimens. The implications of this discovery weighed heavily on Ezra's mind as he considered the broader scope of what he had stumbled upon. Morrison and his associates were clearly part of a larger organization that specialized in capturing and selling wild animals to the highest bidder. The remote location, the sophisticated restraining equipment, and the detailed documentation all pointed to an operation that had been running for some time and had likely claimed many victims. As he processed this information, Ezra became aware that the wolf had approached him again. this time carrying something in her mouth. She dropped the object at his feet and stepped back, watching his reaction with those remarkably expressive eyes. What she had brought him was a piece of fabric, torn and weathered, but clearly from human clothing. The implication sent a chill through him as he realized that the wolf might be trying to communicate something important about previous victims of Morrison's enterprise. The fabric appeared to be from a woman's dress, the pattern and quality suggesting it had belonged to someone of refinement rather than a typical frontier settler. Ezra studied the material carefully, noting that the tears appeared fresh despite the weathering, indicating that whoever had worn this garment had encountered Morrison's group recently. The thought that there might be other victims, possibly still alive and in need of rescue, added urgency to an already complex situation. Thunder had been growing increasingly restless as the afternoon wore on, his keen animal instincts detecting something that had not yet registered with his human companion. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, and he snorted nervously while pawing the ground in a display of agitation that Ezra had learned to respect over their years together. Whatever was troubling the Mustang deserved serious consideration. Following his horse's gaze toward the canyon entrance, Ezra spotted the source of Thunder's concern. Dust clouds on the horizon indicated approaching riders, at least 4 or 5 based on the size and density of the disturbance they were creating. Whether they were additional members of Morrison's gang or simply travelers passing through the area remained to be seen, but their timing was suspiciously coincidental with the recent violence. The wolf had also detected the approaching presence, her ears perking up and her body tensing in preparation for possible flight. However, rather than immediately fleeing with her cub, she looked toward Ezra as if seeking guidance or reassurance. This extraordinary display of trust from a wild animal in such circumstances struck him as almost supernatural in its improbability. Quickly gathering the evidence he had discovered, Ezra stuffed Morrison's journal and correspondence into his own saddlebag while keeping his rifle close at hand. The approaching riders would arrive within the hour, and he needed to make critical decisions about how to handle this increasingly complicated situation. The safety of the wolf and her cub remained his primary concern, but the possibility of other victims added layers of moral complexity that could not be ignored. As the dust clouds drew closer, Ezra could make out individual riders silhouetted against the harsh desert light. Their formation and approach suggested military or law enforcement training rather than the casual riding style typical of outlaw gangs. This observation brought both relief and new concerns. While these newcomers might not pose an immediate threat, they would certainly have questions about the bodies scattered around the canyon floor. The wolf seemed to sense his internal conflict and made an extraordinary decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not witnessed it firsthand. Rather than fleeing to safety with her cub, she positioned herself between Ezra and the canyon entrance, as if offering to stand guard while he prepared for the approaching confrontation. Her intelligent eyes conveyed a message as clear as spoken words. She trusted him completely and was prepared to face whatever dangers lay ahead at his side. This display of loyalty from a creature he had rescued less than 4 hours earlier moved Ezra profoundly. In his 30 years of life on the frontier, he had seen countless examples of both human and animal behavior, but nothing had prepared him for the depth of understanding and gratitude that this remarkable wolf was demonstrating. The bond that had formed between them seemed to transcend normal relationships between species. The approaching riders had closed to within half a mile, and their intentions would soon become clear. Ezra could see that they wore uniforms of some kind, though the details remained obscured by distance and heat shimmer. If they were territorial marshals or army scouts, his actions in killing Morrison and his associates would likely be viewed favorably given the evidence of criminal activity. However, if they were federal agents investigating the animal trafficking operation, the situation could become significantly more complicated. As the tension built toward this new confrontation, The wolf cub provided an unexpected moment of levity by attempting to play with one of Thunder's reins that had fallen within reach. The young animal's fearless interaction with the massive horse demonstrated the adaptability and courage that would serve it well in the challenges ahead. Even Thunder seemed charmed by the cub's antics, lowering his great head to investigate the small new companion with gentle curiosity. The riders were close enough now for Ezra to confirm that they wore the badges of territorial marshals, a development that brought considerable relief given the circumstances. Leading the group was a man Ezra recognized from his occasional visits to territorial settlements, Marshal Thomas Hartwell, a fair but uncompromising lawman whose reputation for honesty had made him many enemies among the criminal element. As Hartwell and his deputies entered the canyon, their experienced eyes quickly took in the scene of recent violence. The marshal's gaze moved from the dead rustlers to the freed wolf and her cub, then settled on Ezra with a calculating assessment of a man accustomed to sorting truth from deception in difficult circumstances. "Ezra Blackwood," Hartwell called out as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "Seems like we arrived just after the excitement ended." The cowboy nodded respectfully, recognizing that his next words would determine how this encounter proceeded. "Marshal Hartwell, these men were torturing that wolf and her cub. When I tried to intervene, they drew on me first." Hartwell's deputies spread out to examine the evidence while their leader approached the scene more closely. The marshal's experienced eye missed nothing: the cruel chain and restraints, Morrison's sophisticated equipment, the obvious signs of prolonged captivity that the wolf had endured. His expression grew increasingly grim as the full scope of what had been happening in this remote location became apparent. "Jake Morrison," Hartwell observed, turning over the body of the gang leader. "We've been tracking him for months. Reports of missing livestock, travelers disappearing, and now this." He gestured toward the wolf, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the marshal's investigation. One of the deputies called out from Morrison's camp area, where he had discovered additional evidence of the criminal enterprise. Hidden beneath carefully arranged rocks were cages of various sizes, all designed to hold captured animals for transport. The discovery painted a picture of systematic cruelty that had likely been operating for months or even years. The marshal's attention was particularly drawn to the wolf's extraordinary behavior. In his years of law enforcement, he had encountered numerous wild animals in various circumstances, but none had ever displayed such apparent intelligence and composure around humans. The creature watched the proceedings with alert interest, showing no signs of the fear or aggression that would be expected from a recently captive wild animal. "That's the damnedest thing I ever seen," one of the deputies muttered as the wolf approached him cautiously and sniffed at his badge with obvious curiosity. "Acts more like a dog than a wild wolf." Ezra found himself struggling to explain the remarkable bond that had developed between himself and the rescued animals. The connection he felt with the wolf seemed to go beyond normal human-animal relationships, entering territory that challenged his understanding of the natural world. Yet the evidence of that bond was undeniable. The wolf continued to treat him as a trusted ally rather than a potential threat. As the marshals continued their investigation, they uncovered more disturbing evidence of Morrison's activities. Hidden compartments in the gang's equipment revealed detailed records of previous captures, including several references to human victims who had apparently stumbled upon the operation. The scope of the criminal enterprise was far larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the canyon floor and creating a sense of urgency about the decisions that needed to be made. The wolf and her cub required ongoing care and protection, but the legal complexities surrounding the situation meant that simple solutions were not readily available. Marshal Hartwell approached Ezra with a combination of respect and curiosity that reflected his assessment of both the man and the extraordinary circumstances. "Blackwood, I've known you by reputation for years, and nothing I've heard suggests you're the type to fabricate stories. But what I'm seeing here challenges everything I thought I knew about wild animals." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from one of the deputies who had been exploring the deeper recesses of the canyon. His discovery would prove to be the most shocking revelation yet, evidence that would transform understanding of Morrison's operation and reveal connections to crimes that stretched across multiple territories. Deep within a natural cave formation, the deputy had found what appeared to be a makeshift prison where human captives had been held. The crude cells were empty now, but recent signs of occupation were unmistakable. Personal belongings, including the remainder of the dress from which the fabric sample had been torn, lay scattered among evidence of prolonged confinement. This discovery cast Morrison's wolf capture in an entirely new light. Rather than being an isolated incident of animal cruelty, it appeared to be part of a much larger criminal enterprise that included human trafficking alongside the exotic animal trade. The implications were staggering and would require resources far beyond what a small group of territorial marshals could provide. As the full scope of the crimes became apparent, Ezra realized that his simple act of rescue had uncovered something that would likely require months of investigation to fully understand. The wolf and her cub had been victims of an operation so complex and far-reaching that their suffering represented only a small fraction of the total harm that had been inflicted. As darkness began to settle over the canyon, Marshal Hartwell made a decision that would change everything. Rather than immediately departing with his evidence, he ordered his deputies to make camp for the night, citing the need for a thorough investigation of the cave system at first light. What he did not share with his men was a growing suspicion that the wolf's behavior indicated something far more extraordinary than anyone had yet realized. Ezra found himself appointed as an unofficial guide, his intimate knowledge of the rescue and the animal's behavior making him invaluable to the ongoing investigation. As the marshal's men set up their temporary camp, the wolf and her cub remained close to Ezra, displaying a level of attachment that continued to baffle everyone present. During the quiet hours of early evening, while the deputies tended to their duties, Marshal Hartwell approached Ezra with a confidence that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The lawman's weathered face bore an expression of deep contemplation as he studied the wolf, who had positioned herself protectively near the campfire. "Blackwood, I've been a marshal for 23 years, Hartwell began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen things that would challenge most men's understanding of what's possible in this world. But that wolf... There's something about her that doesn't fit any pattern I've ever encountered." As if responding to the mention of her presence, the wolf raised her head and looked directly at the marshal with those remarkable amber eyes. For a long moment, the two regarded each other in silence, and Hartwell's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. "It's like she understands every word we're saying," the marshal continued, his voice filled with wonder. "I've worked with tracking dogs, hunting hounds, every kind of trained animal you can imagine. None of them ever showed this level of awareness." Ezra nodded slowly, having reached similar conclusions throughout their extraordinary day together. "She's been watching everything, Marshal, taking in details like she's trying to piece together what happened here before we arrived." The conversation was interrupted by a soft whimper from the wolf cub, who had been exploring the perimeter of their camp with typical youthful curiosity. The young animal had discovered something partially buried in the sand near the cave entrance, something that made both men freeze with shock when they realized what they were seeing. Protruding from the sandy soil was the corner of what appeared to be a leather-bound book, its edges worn but still intact despite obvious exposure to the elements. Ezra carefully excavated the object while the wolf watched with intense interest, her body language suggesting recognition of something significant. The book proved to be a diary, its pages filled with elegant handwriting that spoke of education and refinement. As Ezra read the opening entries by firelight, a story began to emerge that would challenge everything they thought they understood about Morrison's operation and the Wolf's extraordinary behavior. The diary belonged to a young woman named Catherine Rosewood, daughter of a prominent Eastern family who had been traveling west to join her fiancé in California. Her entries described a journey that had begun with hope and excitement, but had quickly turned into a nightmare when her stagecoach was attacked by Morrison's gang 3 months earlier. What made Catherine's account truly remarkable was her detailed description of a fellow prisoner, a magnificent wolf who had been captured shortly before her own arrival at the Canyon prison. According to her entries, the wolf had already been held captive for weeks when Catherine was brought to the cave complex, and the animal's behavior had been a source of comfort and companionship during her darkest hours. "She watches me with such intelligent eyes," Catherine had written. "Sometimes I imagine she understands my words, my fears, my desperate hope for rescue. When I speak to her, she tilts her head and listens as if every word matters. In this place of cruelty and despair, she has become my anchor to sanity." The diary entries painted a picture of an extraordinary relationship between human and animal that transcended normal boundaries. Catherine described how the wolf had shared her own meager food rations when their captors forgot to provide adequate nourishment, and how the animal's presence had provided psychological comfort that made survival possible during the worst periods of their imprisonment. More disturbing were Catherine's accounts of Morrison's plans for both her and the wolf. The gang leader had been negotiating with buyers who specialized in exotic acquisitions for wealthy collectors in distant territories. Catherine was to be sold into a form of slavery that existed in the lawless regions beyond territorial jurisdiction, while the wolf was destined for private menageries where rare animals were displayed as trophies. As Ezra continued reading, he discovered entries that explained the wolf's remarkable behavior in terms that sent chills down his spine. Catherine had spent hours each day talking to her fellow prisoner, sharing her thoughts, fears, and memories as a way of maintaining her sanity. In response, the wolf had begun displaying behaviors that suggested not just intelligence, but genuine emotional connection and understanding. "Today she brought me a small flower that had somehow taken root in a crack in the cave wall," one entry read. "Such a simple gesture, yet it spoke of compassion that I never expected to find in a wild creature. She seems to sense when my spirits are lowest and always finds ways to provide comfort." The final entries in Catherine's diary revealed the desperate plan that had led to her escape. Morrison's gang had been preparing to transport both prisoners to their respective buyers when a rival criminal organization had attacked the Canyon complex. In the chaos that followed, Catherine had managed to free herself and attempt to liberate the wolf as well. However, the wolf had recently given birth to her cub and refused to abandon her offspring despite Catherine's desperate pleas. Understanding that time was running out, Catherine had been forced to flee alone, leaving behind the animal who had become her closest friend and confidant during months of shared captivity. The diary's final entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, revealed Catherine's promise to return with help for the wolf and her cub. She had escaped into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back, determined to find law enforcement and mount a rescue operation for the creatures who had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. As the implications of Catherine's story sank in, Marshall Hartwell's expression grew increasingly grim. If this woman escaped 2 weeks ago, where is she now? Why hasn't she contacted authorities? The answer to that question came in the form of evidence that the deputies discovered while expanding their search of the cave complex. Hidden in a natural alcove were personal belongings that had clearly been scattered by someone in desperate haste. Items that matched descriptions from Catherine's diary of possessions she had been forced to leave behind. Among these belongings was a small silver locket containing a photograph of a young woman whose refined features and intelligent eyes bore a striking resemblance to the wolf's own remarkable gaze. The coincidence was so extraordinary that it seemed to suggest connections beyond normal understanding. as if shared suffering had created bonds that transcended species boundaries. The wolf's reaction to the discovery of Catherine's belongings provided the most compelling evidence, yet of the relationship described in the diary. Upon seeing the scattered items, the animal became visibly agitated, whimpering softly and pawing at objects that clearly held significance for her. Her distress was so apparent that even the hardened deputies were moved by the obvious depth of her emotional attachment. As the night wore on and the investigation continued, a picture emerged of Morrison's operation that was far more sophisticated and cruel than anyone had initially realized. The gang leader had not simply been capturing animals for profit, he had been orchestrating a complex criminal enterprise that treated both human and animal victims as commodities to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. The evidence suggested that Catherine Rosewood had not been Morrison's only human victim. References in the gang leader's correspondence indicated a steady stream of travelers who had disappeared in this remote region over the past year. Most had probably been killed outright, but those with particular value, young women, exotic animals, individuals with specialized skills, had been held for sale to criminal networks operating beyond the reach of territorial law. Marshal Hartwell's investigation revealed that Morrison had been working with contacts throughout the Southwest, maintaining a network of buyers and sellers who dealt in human misery as casually as others might trade cattle or horses. The scope of the operation required resources and organization that suggested backing from powerful interests with significant financial resources. As dawn approached, the wolf's behavior took on new urgency. Rather than resting peacefully with her cub as would be expected after their ordeal, she began moving restlessly around the camp, frequently approaching the cave entrance and whimpering softly. Her agitation suggested that something important was driving her beyond normal maternal instincts. Ezra found himself drawn to follow the wolf's movements, trusting in the extraordinary connection that had developed between them. As he approached the cave entrance in the early morning light, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the faint sound of human voices echoing from deep within the rock formation. The discovery that there might still be living prisoners in the cave complex galvanized everyone into immediate action. Marshal Hartwell organized his deputies into search teams while Ezra prepared to venture into the unknown depths of the underground prison. The wolf, sensing the urgency of the situation, positioned herself at the head of the group as if offering to guide them to whatever lay hidden in the darkness. What they found in the deepest recesses of the cave system would challenge every assumption they had made about Morrison's operation and reveal the true scope of the horrors that had been perpetrated in this remote location. Hidden behind natural rock formations that had been deliberately concealed were additional prison cells, and in one of them, barely alive but still breathing, was Catherine Rosewood. The young woman's condition was critical after 2 weeks of exposure and starvation in the desert, but her eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had enabled her to survive months of captivity. When she saw the wolf approaching her makeshift prison, tears of joy streamed down her face as she whispered the animal's name, Luna, Catherine's reunion with the wolf she had named. During their shared imprisonment was one of the most extraordinary scenes any of the men had ever witnessed. Luna pressed close to her human friend, whimpering softly and gently licking Catherine's hands in a display of affection that spoke of bonds forged through shared suffering and mutual support. "She saved my life," Catherine whispered as Ezra and the marshal worked to free her from her restraints. "When I was ready to give up hope, Luna reminded me that life was worth fighting for. She taught me that kindness and compassion could survive even in the darkest places." The story that Catherine told as they helped her to safety revealed the full extent of Morrison's crimes and explained the extraordinary relationship between woman and wolf that had sustained both through their ordeal. Luna had not simply been another victim of the gang's cruelty. She had been a source of strength and comfort that had made survival possible for both prisoners. As they emerged from the cave complex into the morning sunlight, Catherine's first concern was for Luna's cub. whose birth during captivity had created the impossible choice that had forced her to attempt escape alone. The reunion between the three survivors, woman, wolf, and cub, created a bond that transcended normal understanding and challenged preconceptions about the relationships possible between humans and wild animals. Marshall Hartwell found himself confronting evidence that would reshape his understanding of justice and compassion in ways he had never imagined. The case against Morrison and his associates was clear-cut from a legal standpoint, but the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the victims raised questions about how the law should address situations that fell outside normal categories of crime and punishment. Catherine's testimony revealed that Luna had saved her life multiple times during their imprisonment, sharing food when rations were scarce and providing warmth during cold desert nights when survival seemed impossible. In return, Catherine had protected Luna from the worst of their captors' cruelty and had taught the intelligent animal words and concepts that had expanded her understanding of human behavior. The bond between woman and wolf had become so strong that separation seemed cruel and unnecessary. Catherine's family wealth and social position provided resources that could ensure Luna's continued care and protection, while Luna's extraordinary intelligence and loyalty made her an ideal companion for someone who had shared her suffering and understood her unique nature. As the day progressed and the legal formalities were completed, it became clear that this extraordinary story would have an equally extraordinary conclusion. Rather than being returned to the wild where her trust in humans might make her vulnerable to future exploitation, Luna would accompany Catherine back to civilization as a living testament to the power of compassion and friendship to survive even the worst circumstances. The transformation in both woman and wolf as they prepared for their new life together was remarkable to witness. Catherine's strength and determination, tested through months of captivity, had emerged stronger than ever, while Luna's intelligence and loyalty had found their perfect expression in protecting and supporting her human friend. Ezra watched the preparations for departure with mixed emotions. His role in rescuing Luna and her cub had led to discoveries that would resonate far beyond this remote canyon, but it had also created bonds that would be difficult to sever. The connection he had felt with the remarkable wolf had been real and profound, but he understood that her true destiny lay with the woman who had shared her darkest hours. As the Marshals' party prepared to escort Catherine and Luna back to territorial headquarters, Ezra made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than returning to his solitary life tracking cattle thieves across the desert, he accepted Marshall Hartwell's offer to join the ongoing investigation into Morrison's criminal network. The scope of the crimes they had uncovered required experienced trackers and individuals who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Ezra's skills and his intimate knowledge of the case made him invaluable to the effort to bring justice to Morrison's other victims and to dismantle the criminal organization that had caused so much suffering. Luna's extraordinary story would become legend throughout the territory, inspiring changes in how law enforcement approached cases involving both human and animal victims. Her intelligence and loyalty challenged assumptions about the capabilities of wild animals and led to new protections for creatures who might possess abilities beyond normal understanding. The cub, who had been too young to remember most of their ordeal, would grow up in Catherine's care, displaying intelligence and loyalty that suggested the remarkable traits witnessed in Luna were not unique, but perhaps characteristic of their bloodline. The little wolf would become a bridge between the wild and civilized worlds, helping humans understand the complex emotional lives of creatures they had previously dismissed as mere animals. Years later, travelers through the territory would still speak of the extraordinary bond between the Eastern lady and her wolf companion, a relationship that had been forged in suffering but had blossomed into something beautiful and transformative. Catherine and Luna's story became a symbol of hope for those who believed that kindness and compassion could triumph over cruelty and exploitation. For Ezra, The events in that remote canyon had changed his understanding of what was possible in a world that often seemed dominated by violence and greed. His decision to dedicate his life to fighting the kind of evil he had encountered there would lead to a distinguished career in law enforcement and the rescue of countless other victims of human trafficking and animal exploitation. The case against Morrison's associates and their network of buyers would take years to fully prosecute, but the evidence gathered in the canyon provided the foundation for dismantling one of the largest criminal organizations operating in the territorial Southwest. The legal precedents established would influence law enforcement approaches to similar crimes for generations to come. Marshall Hartwell's final report on the Morrison case would become required reading at territorial law enforcement academies, not just for its detailed documentation of criminal investigation techniques, but for its thoughtful analysis of the ethical questions raised by the extraordinary relationship between Catherine and Luna. As the sun set on their final day in the canyon where so much suffering had occurred, but where redemption had also been found, the survivors prepared to begin new chapters in their lives. The bonds forged through shared adversity would endure, but the future held promise for healing and growth that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of their captivity. Luna's legacy would extend far beyond her own remarkable story. Her demonstrated intelligence and emotional depth would inspire researchers and animal behaviorists to reconsider their understanding of wolf cognition and social structures. The scientific community would eventually recognize that her abilities, while exceptional, were not supernatural but represented the upper limits of what was possible for her species under the right circumstances. Catherine's advocacy for both human and animal rights would make her a prominent figure in territorial politics and social reform movements. Her unique perspective, shaped by months of shared captivity with Luna, would influence legislation protecting vulnerable populations and ensuring that victims of trafficking received appropriate care and support regardless of species. The story of the cowboy who found a chained wolf would be retold countless times around campfires and in saloons throughout the frontier, but those who heard it secondhand could never fully appreciate the profound impact that those extraordinary days had on everyone involved. For Ezra, Catherine, Luna, and even Marshall Hartwell, the events had revealed truths about courage, compassion, and connection that would guide their choices for the rest of their lives. In the end, what had begun as a simple act of rescue had uncovered a complex web of crime and cruelty, but it had also demonstrated the power of individual actions to create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The chained wolf had been freed, but in the process, she had also helped free the humans around her from limited understanding of what relationships between species could achieve. As they rode away from the canyon for the final time, none of them looked back. The future held challenges and opportunities that would test everything they had learned about themselves and each other, but they faced those unknowns with confidence born from having survived the worst and discovered the best of what both human and animal nature could offer. The legend of Luna and Catherine would inspire countless other stories of unusual friendships and extraordinary loyalty. But for those who had lived through the reality, no embellishment was necessary. They had witnessed something truly miraculous, the transformation of suffering into strength, captivity into freedom, and fear into love that transcended all boundaries.